So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I hope that you're keeping well and healthy and safe. My name is Kaveh Shahrooz. I am the Deputy Head of Secretariat for the Voluntary Principles Initiative. I want to take this opportunity to welcome you and to thank you for making the time for this introduction of the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights. We have, I believe, an informative and thought-provoking event for you today. The event is in fact an introduction to two things. First, the voluntary principles as principles, a series of voluntary standards adopted primarily by companies and governments to ensure that their use of public and private security complies with international human rights standards. The second is the voluntary principles as an initiative, and we call this the Voluntary Principles Initiative, or the VPI, which is a multi-stakeholder organization comprised of three pillars: the corporate pillar, the government pillar, and the NGO pillar. We also have a number of excellent observers who play an important role in the VPIs. Presenting this information today will be a group of really terrific and knowledgeable speakers. They'll talk about the VPs and the VPIs as a whole, as well as some opportunities and challenges. First will be Maura Johnson, a lawyer with deep expertise on multi-stakeholder initiatives who serves as the head of the VPI Secretariat. She'll provide an overview of the voluntary principles. Secondly, we'll hear from Brian Gonzalez, VP of Security and Human Rights at AngloGold Ashanti. He has been with the VPI for a long time and brings a wealth of experience to the corporate pillar and to the initiative as a whole. We'll then hear from Doug Brooks, who's the special advisor responsible for business practices at Fund for Peace, which is a non-governmental organization. And finally, we'll hear from Leslie Taylor, a Foreign Affairs Officer at the US Department of State. She too has been with the VPI for several years and is an expert on the issues, particularly those related to the government pillar. After they've had a chance to speak, I'll moderate a Q&A session. And for this, I ask that you please use the chat or Q&A functions to send your questions. I'll read those questions to our panel. Each of our speakers will speak for approximately 10 minutes. So I want to thank you again for attending. And with that, I want to turn the mic over to Maura Johnson.
Great. Thank you so much, Kaveh. Can we get the presentation up? Just a couple of quick notes. I will be delivering a presentation. In order that we can get to our other speakers, I'll do sort of a quick overview, and I might go a little quickly over some of the slides. But we will post this presentation on our website along with a recording of this session. So you can always go back to it if you're interested, or you can always come to us with any supplementary questions. Great. And I also just wanted to mention that we are in full lockdown here with our kids at home, so I apologize in advance for any interruptions. So next slide, please. As Kaveh mentioned, the Voluntary Principles is both a set of principles which provide guidance to companies in the extractive, harvesting, natural resources, and energy sectors to effectively manage risks and to manage their security operations in a way that reduces the risk of human rights abuses. It's also a multi-stakeholder initiative established in 2000 and serves as a platform for mutual learning, problem solving, building best practices on security and human rights challenges. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, and as Kaveh mentioned, it's a multi-stakeholder initiative based of companies, government, civil society. The VPI does support in-country implementation working groups, which meet regularly to discuss security and human rights issues and work towards improving trust and mutually agreeable solutions on the ground level. These in-country groups, but more generally, the initiative really does foster more effective engagement at a community, local, and international level between all kinds of stakeholders, including NGOs, human rights organizations, that can really help companies and governments understand risk, conduct conflict analysis, as well as work together to deepen trust and improve problem solving. Next slide, please. So why implement the voluntary principles? Well, the VPs can help governments and companies operationalize their duty to protect, respect, and fulfill international human rights obligations as outlined in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. They'll improve a company's human rights performance, relationships with communities, and help contribute to greater stability in operating environments. Implementation can even potentially reduce exposure to litigation, help with a company's reputation, and also help make it an employer of choice, promoting the company's culture and values. Next slide. The VPs are aligned with international human rights standards. As you know, the UNGPs were adopted unanimously by the Human Rights Council in 2010. The VPs assist states with their state duty to protect human rights through direct implementation and public security, and working with companies in their jurisdiction and promoting the initiative. I'm sure Leslie will have a little bit more to say about this. The UNGPs call for companies to conduct risk assessments, to respect internationally recognized rights, meaning to not infringe them, and to address adverse impacts with whom they are involved. And the VPs help them to do that in the security sector. Next slide, please. So the VPs are integrated and aligned with other global codes and standards. And a few examples are there. IFC Performance Standard 4, OECD Due Diligence, it's embedded in some of these standards, the Conflict-Free Gold Standard, for example, the ICMM Mining Principles. We also, as an initiative, Kaveh mentioned the observers, we endeavor to collaborate and with these multi-stakeholder initiatives and industry associations and so on to collaborate and work together as much as we can. Next slide, please. So there are three components of the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights. I'll go over this quite quickly because I expect Brian and others might talk a little bit more about it. There's a risk assessment. There's the interactions between companies and public security, and there's interactions between companies and private security. Next slide, please. So talking about the risk assessment, and maybe pop over to the next slide, please. The risk assessment is intended to look at not just risks to companies, which is sort of the classic understanding of risk, but also to assess risks of human rights abuses to local rights holders. Different risks will be present in the exploration phase, construction phase, and operational phase of the companies of operations. And I would say as well, you know, have a look at the standards, at the principles on the internet. I mean, it's quite comprehensive. It requires companies to do conflict analysis, for example, you know, it's quite comprehensive human rights risk assessment. So just to provide some examples of risks to local populations, I mean, human rights risks related to interactions with security providers, environmental damage, conflict between workers and community members, gender-based violence, increased traffic accidents, strain on natural resources. And then risks to companies would be, for example, violence against company personnel, theft, property damage, and legal challenges from concerned groups. Next slide, please. So when you can, in the conduct of a risk assessment, once you know and understand the risks, of course, there's a need to mitigate the risks to the extent possible. So here are some examples: strong human rights policies and procedures, including rules of engagement, human rights screenings and trainings, engagement, effective engagement, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. So now we'll move to interactions with public security. Next slide, please. So the risks are quite, companies are often required by law are expected to employ public security. Risks arise without command and control over security that would allow for effective implementation of policies and procedures. So there are best practices. I think Doug is going to talk a little bit more about this. Regular consultations, for example, in inserting clauses in MOUs on human rights standards, and we do have some model clauses on the Voluntary Principles website. Next slide, please. The next section is on interactions with private security. Next slide, please. So the companies will often employ security contractors. In this case, it is easier to mitigate the risks. Companies can include conditions within contracts. They place contractors under control of employees, such as a security manager. Private security company standards and best practices are now well established and widely implemented. For example, ICOCA. Private security contractors should follow the same HR policies, procedures, rules, and training regimes as in-house employees. And companies should seek to employ private security providers from the local population as a best practice. Next slide, please. Reporting human rights incidents. So all VPI stakeholders can play a role in ensuring that human rights incidents receive an appropriate and timely response. Under the principles, companies should record and report to appropriate authorities credible allegations of human rights abuses involving private or public security forces. Companies should require that concerned individuals are withdrawn from the site until an investigation is concluded. And as a reminder, the UN guiding principles require that effective judicial and non-judicial remedies be available to rights holders, including an operational level grievance mechanism for companies. Members can conduct or encourage investigations as appropriate, monitor their status, and press for proper resolution. Next slide, please. Responding to changes in the operating environment. So companies should regularly update risk and conflict analyses, including when major political, social, or economic events occur, or alongside any major business decision. Engagement with communities should be ongoing. Good relations act as a warning system. Communities should certainly be informed of any upcoming changes and have access to channels for dialogue. And on an ongoing basis, governments, companies, NGOs should exchange intel and perspective on events and trends that could affect the security of the operating environment. By regularly reviewing and verifying VP's related policies and practices, members can ensure their approach remains current in changing contexts. Next slide. Attention to vulnerable groups. Companies should consider the needs of vulnerable groups such as human rights defenders, Indigenous people, women, and children in both risk assessment and mitigation. Companies should engage a range of stakeholders and expertise to ensure different perspectives are included. New tools to support VPI members in integrating vulnerable group and gender-based analysis will be available in the future. This is an ongoing project. Next slide, please. Working with other stakeholders on implementation. This slide I'll just go over quickly, but just to highlight that meaningful consultation with community is a critical part of the voluntary principles, sets the stage for the likelihood of human rights throughout the life project cycle. So next slide. I'll just go through a little bit quickly the last couple of slides. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of elements from the strategy, some of our VPI priorities. We do have a strategy available on the website. Just a few areas of focus to mention. We're advancing implementation through support to in-country multi-stakeholder groups. We're currently supporting 3 working groups, Ghana, Nigeria, and Myanmar, as well. We're supporting a project in Peru. We're working to provide guidance and assistance on complex implementation issues. I mentioned the project on gender vulnerable groups, in which we're hiring a consultant to provide some guidance. We also have a project to understand conflict drivers and due diligence in conflict affected areas. As well, we will be producing guidance on protecting human rights defenders. Another key priority is to strengthen accountability and governance within the initiative. And lastly, strategic collaboration with other initiatives, the UN Working Group, ICOCA, DCAP, OECD, and many other organizations. Last slide, please, Tristy. I think I'll end it there. We could certainly delve deeper into some of the issues in the Q&A period, and I look forward to hearing from Brian and the others panelists. Thank you so much.
Maura, thank you so much for that. And with that, I turn it over to Brian Gonzalez, who I mentioned at the outset is the VP of the Security and Human Rights Group at Anglo Coalition. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Kaveh. Yeah, good afternoon from where I am to all. Firstly, let me just take this opportunity to thank the Secretariat for facilitating this webinar. I think it's very important that we intensify the outreach efforts, and I think that's what the session is all about today. And thank you for the opportunity, for me to share my experiences and thoughts on the implementation of the VPs. And what I'll try to do in my discussion is just talk about, why we joined the initiative, what we've done, how we've done it, and then maybe just to also share what benefits and value we have derived from being part of the VPs. I think up front, it must be recognized that the COVID-19 pandemic has not just caused disruption, pain, grief for people across the world, but very importantly shown our collective efforts between a range of stakeholders, governments, multilateral organizations, NGOs, communities, business, and obviously the broader civil society and other institutions can rally together in countries across the world to achieve a common goal. And that common goal is to minimize the loss of life and livelihoods. And why I use this in the introduction, just reflecting on what I've just said, I think it reemphasizes the need to have multi-stakeholder initiatives like the VPs, which promote collective action from all relevant stakeholders, to address security and human rights issues across the globe. And I think everyone will agree that's on this call that obviously that is a challenge, a global challenge that we are facing in many countries. And I think, the VPs is one of those tools or mechanisms to try and prevent security and human rights issues. I think as a business practitioner in the extractive industry, specifically mining for 33 years, 23 of these years I've spent in the security and sustainability space. I can confidently say that being introduced to the VPs in 2007, that's when AngloGold Ashanti joined this initiative. Back then it prompted introspection into whether we were doing enough in addressing security and human rights challenges in our organization. It was also at a time where the potential for conflict was high. We were experiencing frequent incidents of conflict and in some cases violence in certain jurisdictions. And all of this was prevalent. And I think joining the initiative afforded us the opportunity to have access to knowledge, obviously experience from other people in the extractive industry, and very importantly, to take guidance from a network of stakeholders and people who were grappling or addressing the significant challenges posed. Since coming to terms with what the VPs was all about at the time, and I'm talking probably 13, 14, 15 years ago, because there was a period before we actually became members of the VPI that we were obviously looking at the VPs critically and how it can help us. But since coming to terms with what the VPs is all about, what it offers, and the guidance that it gives, there's 5 key principles or components that have stuck with me. And certainly within our organization, whenever security strategy or planning is discussed or reviewed, these 5 things to me is at the forefront, and Maura has mentioned a couple of those already. The first one obviously is risk assessment, continuous threat and risk analysis to determine the potential for conflict. And paired with that is, the identification of security risks, looking at the potential for violence, obviously what's the rule of law in a certain jurisdiction, and there's a whole lot of other components that go with it. But I think that's the starting point is risk assessment. Then how we interact with private security. A lot of us in the extractive industry and specifically in the mining industry We make extensive use of our own in-house security service providers, but very much we make use of private security providers in the different countries where we operate. And that interaction is really about, you know, that private security should be observing the policies of our company or the company that they contracted with. And it's all about ethical conduct and the respect for human rights. The third thing is how we interact with public security, as Maura mentioned. And very importantly, I think in a lot of instances in many countries, especially in conflict or post-conflict countries, where there might be poor rule of law, or you know, there's problems with capacity in those countries, your security arrangements, because you're going to rely on public security in obviously these volatile areas and jurisdictions that you operate in, and that's where security arrangements become critical. You have to agree on deployment and conduct of public security, which is obviously not the easiest thing, because us as private companies, you know, cannot dictate to public security how they should be conducting their business, but certainly, you know, through dialogue and engagement, we can influence the way that is done. Then the other two that I think is critical, and especially for security professionals and security practitioners, is looking at the use of minimum force and having processes and procedures in place to govern the use of minimum force, obviously using the use of force continuum. And the last one is rules of engagement. You know, whether it's social protest or whether it is addressing general criminality, whether it's your private security or public security, you know, the rules of engagement have to be agreed upon right up front in how you're going to address a certain situation. That normally will come out of your risk assessments. And obviously, going back to the use of force, it must always be proportionate to the situation that you're addressing. So those 5 things have stuck with me, and I think those 5 things, you know, if every security practitioner understands that, it goes a long way in you know, complying with the principles of the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights. What I can also say is whether we operate in conflict, post-conflict, or stable security environments, you know, is not a gauge for the levels of implementation of the VPs in a certain jurisdiction. I think the basic principles shape our security practices and should be non-negotiable. Obviously, your risk assessment will determine, you know, the level of security that is needed. From a company perspective, I think, you know, for us, the VPs definitely forms a very important part of living the values of our company. It furthermore enhances our human rights due diligence efforts. And obviously, like a lot of companies are doing, and as Maura said, with the advent of the UNGPs being adopted in 2010, you know, the whole issue around governments protect and business must respect and providing collective access to remedy, you know, embedding the UNGPs in our organizations, I think is crucial for us to be upstanding organizations. And what we're trying to do as a company, obviously, is embedding the UNGPs and getting it to be part of the DNA of our organization. The fact that the UNGPs came after the VPs, I mean, 2000 the VPs was established, and 2010 it was the UNGPs were basically adopted. Because of that, it allowed us to also glean on the learnings of implementing the VPs to assist in implementing the UNGPs in our organization. And I think it's important to clarify that the role the VPs plays is a very important component of the UNGPs, because it complements your human rights due diligence efforts, which is intended to minimize the potential for conflict and negative impact on all stakeholders, specifically the communities and general public in the areas where we operate. I can also say, with security being at the forefront in organizations and where we operate, you know, they 24/7, 365 days a year. They become your eyes and ears on the ground, and it goes a long way if they fully understand human rights challenges and the respect for human rights, you know, to enhance your human rights due diligence efforts. The additional value is when incidents do occur, and certainly us as an organization, you know, we've had many incidents over the last 15 years. The VPs acts and gives us a guide in how we respond with the absolute respect for human rights. And one of those things that Maura also touched on, you know, is that we need to collectively with other stakeholders ensure that there is access to remedy when potential human rights violations are evident. So I think implementing and embedding the VPs into the way we do business over the last 13 years has definitely been beneficial. We have seen significant strides in preventing and minimizing conflict, reducing allegations of potential human rights abuse, and very importantly, minimizing harm to people, whether it's internal to the company or external people in and around our mine sites. The handling of social protests, and that's something that's becoming more and more prevalent, you know, across various jurisdictions. You know, the way private security and public security handle these situations in many of the countries where we're operating in, where we've worked with private security and public security, has also improved significantly. And yeah, it's about the use of minimum force, and the rules of engagement principles need to be advocated at all times. And where it's not complied with, it needs to be addressed, you know, immediately. So I guess in our experience over the last 10 years, you know, it's enabled us to continuously refine our security strategy, which is very much informed by the VPs. In fact, you know, I always say the VPs is the key driver for our security management practices. You know, our strategy that we've been refining probably over the last 10 years, you know, is built around community enhanced security. Maura also mentioned the engagement with community. Community is an integral part of, you know, the VPs and the implementation of the principles. And just very quickly, 5 things from us, you know, that our strategy is built around, aligned to the VPs, is removing people from risk and risk from people. By doing that, you reduce the potential for conflict. You need to define and understand the role of communities in complementing security initiatives, not just of your operation, but in the area where you are operating. Defining the role of public security to support this whole notion of community non-security, and where public security becomes part of community policing initiatives, where community also take ownership. And then very much, you know, the role of technology to reduce risk, and I don't need to go into the detail, and then making sure you have trained, skilled teams that can respond and react to problems and handle situations with absolute respect for human rights. I think just in closing for me, just a couple of learnings I think I can share, which I believe is critical and is key to successful implementation. You know, the robust incident investigation management and reporting processes need to be in place. You need to be transparent and have full disclosure. If something happens, which is only normal, if there is an incident, there needs to be the investigation, there needs to be full transparency, and there should be full disclosure on what happened involving all stakeholders. And then obviously the development of good relationships with communities, with public security, and how you get everyone working in the same direction, sharing the space and co-designing sustainable solutions for security. So when your operation isn't there, one seizes in a certain jurisdiction, you know, these initiatives that you started with all the stakeholders are sustained and can carry on. And then very importantly, it's about embedding the UNGPs. It's about enhancing your human rights due diligence process, and the VPSHR being one component of the broader human rights framework, I think goes a long way in improving what you're trying to do. So I guess key to success: commitment, collective effort, extensive dialogue, stakeholder engagement, and communication internally and externally. And in closing, I would like to leave you with a quote that I use very much in these type of panels or talks, a very profound quote from the former president of Ireland and past UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, who said, "Today's human rights violations are the causes of tomorrow's conflicts." And I think we should all reflect on that. And with that, I thank you for listening. Thank you.
Ryan, thank you so much for that excellent overview. I want to turn it over to Doug now, but before I do so, I just want to, again, ask our audience, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function or the chat function. I noticed in particular one person's got their hand up. That's great. We welcome your question, but please use the Q&A function. I want to turn it over now to Doug Brooks, who, as I mentioned, is the Special Advisor for Responsible Business Practices at Fund for Peace, which is an NGO.
Good morning. Thank you. So I've been with the Fund for Peace for almost a year, but I've been working with the Fund for Peace for almost 2 decades. And this includes time I was running a trade association representing companies that provide services in conflict, post-conflict, and disaster relief environments. FFP is an extraordinary organization for many reasons, including running the quarterly Human Rights and Business Roundtable, but perhaps it's best known for the Fragile States Index, and it has been with the Voluntary Principles since the early days. So I've been asked to talk a bit about working with public security. There's an example from the late 1990s where there was an incident where soldiers used an oil company helicopter and boats to attack and burn down several villages in the Niger Delta. It was claimed this event was a counterattack resulting from an earlier confrontation at an oil rig, but the military and communities disagreed on the origin. The response of the soldiers was disproportionate and excessive. The resulting problems for the company from this and other incidents was pretty drastic. There was damage to the brand, there were lawsuits, there were attacks by human rights groups and worldwide protests, there was legitimization of attacks by radicals on other facilities owned by the company. The overhead costs for increased hardening of sites and additional security were costs that hit the shareholders. We've had similar examples of that past and even to this day, but what is clear is that companies and NGOs that use security or rely on public security are kidding themselves if they claim they have nothing to do with or no control over the public security. So what the Voluntary Principles did was bring together companies, NGOs, based on the idea that no one wins these scenarios when these things happen. There turned out to be quite a bit that could be done that benefits the human rights side and the company's bottom lines when they came to some agreements. They developed mutually agreed guidelines for firms working with security, with public security, including and private security. The guidelines can be used by anyone with positive results and can help governments better understand how their own security can be improved when providing this kind of security. Many companies who are reluctant to buy into the idea early on have seen the results and have now become devoted to the guidelines that these policies created. The voluntary principles, and also there's something called the IFC Performance Standard 4 or PS4, essentially cover the same ground. They cover, basically, they require companies to assess the security risks, and this has been discussed already, where their operations have and what the risks could create for the communities where they are setting up their operations. It develops ways to manage and mitigate these risks. It suggests managing private security responsibly, engaging with public security, and to consider and investigate allegations of unlawful acts by security personnel. So a firm's relationship to public security is a part of any risk assessment. Public security is not controlled by the firm, but it brings significant risks with it. What is the training of public security? What is their human rights backgrounds? What are the rules for force or deadly force that they use when they're providing security for an operation? Private security or company employees is much easier to control. You can use a contract to control private security. The contract can set the rules for the use of force. It can set guidelines on how the training is done. It can require background checks on all the personnel that are going to be working for you. Employees are often just managers of the contracts, not actual security themselves. I think most of the companies actually will have security managers who don't actually do the security, but make sure that the security is professional and doing things in a way that do not violate human rights. You have to ask, is public security on call, or do they actually have a direct relationship with the public security? So for example, in the example I gave, you had boats and helicopters that were being used by public security to provide security for an extractive company. Is a company providing food or lodging to the public security? Is it paying salaries to the public security? And this is not unusual. Oftentimes there are bonuses or salaries, or sometimes the governments aren't even paying their security that is providing security for a private entity. And so you end up having, since starving soldiers are not good for security, you often have, or sometimes have, companies that will actually cover their salaries. Is the company providing equipment? Is it providing uniforms? Is it providing lethal and non-lethal weapons, radios, all sorts of things that could basically impact on the company and how its security behaves? And does the very presence of public security bring risks to the communities around the project? What is the nature of any relationship between the public security and the firm's private security or management? Many times you'll have a case where you have a private security that is protecting a company, but if something significant happens, they will call the public security. And then you need to know that they're going to be able to work together in a way that does not create additional problems. What is the stated human rights policies of the public security you're working with? Do they even have human rights policies? And is there some way to hold public security accountable? The voluntary principles can be used as leverage to motivate the professionalization of public security. We understand you have no policies regarding human rights training, but we are bound as a company by the voluntary principles to make sure that there is some sort of standard there. IFC offers some suggestions on managing this relationship. So who is likely to respond to your security needs when you have them? Is it a military? Is it the police? Do you know who's going to come if you call for help? What sort of engagement do you have with public security? Are you communicating with them? Are you promoting practices and proportional use of force? Have you developed a relationship with the public security so that you know each other, you know what's going to happen? And have you established any MOUs so that you have an agreement exactly how the public security will behave if they come to assist? And finally, the IFC, and this is in addition to what you have in the voluntary principles, it really suggests a document of engagement. So it essentially just says every time you reach out to public security that you document it. Every time that you provide additional training on human rights or on professionalization, you document it. Just keep track of that, and that's just important from all sorts of legal perspectives that this is enshrined. So companies largely recognize that they have a very real interest in public security behaving professionally, financial, ethical, professional. And the voluntary principles and PS4 are extremely useful in ways to lower risks and lower the costs to the companies. These voluntary principle guidelines are strongly supported and adhered to by the bulk of the relevant industries in this area. This is a great example of this. Last year in 2020, when there was violent clashes in Washington, D.C. between police and protesters, many of the police actions were widely perceived as excessive. the VPI came out with a statement strongly pushed along by the commercial pillar. It said among other things, and here's a quote: "The voluntary principles require public security providers such as police to act in a manner that is consistent. With the protection and promotion of human rights in accordance with the rule of law. According to the principles, force is to be used only when strictly necessary and to an extent proportional to the threat. Where force is used, this should be reported and investigated, and medical aid should be provided to any injured persons. Furthermore, public security forces should not violate the rights of individuals while exercising their right to freedom of association and peaceful assembly." And it's interesting to me, this is the commercial sector that's pushing this idea on the public sector and saying, we're doing these things, we're doing what's right, why aren't you? I thought it was a really interesting moment in history. So again, some key points: communicate with public security. Emphasize the need for proportionality of response. If you can do background checks with public security, and you don't always have that kind of control, but if you can, make sure there's background checks being done on the people that may be responding. Promote good training and professionalism. If you're allowed to, you can do your own courses or promote best practices with the public security. And finally, document and encourage the accountability. Now, let me just say a word about being part of the NGO pillar in the voluntary principles. Being an NGO in this larger group is a huge influence multiplier. So while you have a lot of NGOs that do or push good ideas and good practices, being a part of the voluntary principles gives you access to other NGOs, but also to companies and governments where your voice is going to be much, much stronger. You'll be recognized as a responsible party rather than just sort of a rogue element. You'll be recognized as an organization focused on results, not just on messaging, and you'll have access. And that's really important in terms of, for most NGOs, and being able to achieve what their goals are. Like any organization, you have to put in effort to get something out. But with the voluntary principles, there are enormous benefits. So let me end there and move on, but happy to answer questions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Doug. I really appreciate it. I'm sure there are going to be questions about that to come. And again, just a call for everyone to please put any questions you have into the Q&A portion of the chat function here. So I'm going to turn it over now to Leslie Taylor, a Foreign Affairs Officer at the U.S. Department of State, and she's going to talk about various elements of the VPs and the government pillar in particular. Take it away, Leslie.
Thanks, Kaveh. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. So I just wanted to thank, first of all, Brian for making the correlation between the UN guiding principles and the voluntary principles, and how by implementing them, you're actually also upholding your UNGP's obligations. And also to Doug for the great presentation on the important role that NGOs can play in the voluntary principles. I want to talk a bit about the government role and some of the responsibilities and also some of the benefits of being a government member. So I guess I'll just start by explaining that the difference between home and host government. So home government is a country where companies are based. So the United States would be one, you know, with a bunch of our extractive companies based here. And then a host government is basically a country where a lot of the companies operate. So Ghana, for example. Anyway, they're both very important relevant actors in supporting the voluntary principles implementation. Home governments like the United States, we help support the voluntary principles through, you know, several different activities. Obviously, diplomatic engagement with other governments, civil society, NGOs. We also do reporting, programming. We've done some programs in the past to help build in-country implementation working groups, and also public diplomacy. Statements if things go wrong. Sometimes we band together with other VPI governments to make collective statements, or we'll speak out on our own. But we often work through our embassies to engage with key players on the ground. So not just host governments, but also the companies, local members of civil society, and then other VPI member governments who have embassies in those respective countries. Our engagement includes a wide swath of activities, for example, coordinating and supporting initiatives by the stakeholders at the local level, providing training. For example, we held a training in Ghana for government and police representatives, I think about 2 years ago, maybe 3. We hold hosting learning forums, promote best practices with regards to implementation, We really just strive to play a convening role. We also support the voluntary principles through our economic policies. For example, we can require or actually encourage companies in which we are providing export credit or loans to commit to implementing the voluntary principles. We try and do this whenever it's applicable. But in general, it's important that governments provide an enabling environment for the implementation of voluntary principles. And a few things that governments do to achieve this include promoting understanding and implementation of the voluntary principles. But this is with companies, civil societies headquartered or operating within our territory here at the United States and also territories abroad through our embassy. We regularly conduct outreach with other governments, companies, NGOs, and encourage them to join the voluntary principles. We just kind of want to bring more companies, NGOs, and governments under the larger umbrella. We also work with stakeholders on the ground to assist them in local implementation. We also work with stakeholders at the international level to coordinate local efforts, share best practices, and promote discussion and learning through case studies. We regularly do an annual report, which all VPI members do. And we also participate in the governance of voluntary principles. So the United States is currently on the steering committee, and we will be again. So we play an important role in the governance of it at the international level. So beyond just the roles, I kind of also want to mention a few of the benefits in joining the VPI. So one of the first headings I would say would be that it helps governments achieve their human rights development and conflict-related policy objectives. And this is kind of where the UN GPs come in again. So systematic use of the voluntary principles can actually reduce the risk of human rights violations. So for example, companies often interact with public or private security providers that seek to protect company operation employees. And if appropriate training and measures are used, it obviously mitigates the chances of human rights abuses. And so stability assists not only the company and civil society, but it also helps the government in fulfilling our duty to protect human rights under the UNGPs. It also promotes a better business environment and reduces the cost of insecurity. Another example of that is implementation is an important step in promoting transparency and good corporate social responsibility practices. So it can actually support other government policy objectives such as development, poverty alleviation, investment, and conflict prevention. So basically improving collaboration and problem solving with companies and civil societies is an important aspect of that. Second, I will say that the VPI is a good forum for collaboration and problem solving. And this is cross-pillar, everyone kind of participates together to do this. Security concerns are particularly challenging issues, and they really benefit from a multi-stakeholder approach because all the different stakeholders bring unique perspectives to bear on the security issue and have access to different types of information. For example, the United States, we have, or government, I should say, we have diplomatic information related to the security sector. Companies have firsthand knowledge regarding the challenges of working with public and private security on the ground, or you have NGOs who have access to information regarding how security-related issues impact local communities. So every pillar has something very important to bring to the table, and by working together and sharing information, we're better equipped to address security concerns collectively. And it's really these cross-pillar relationships that have aided in the fostering and trust of the, in their capacity to respond to challenges as they arise. For example, when NGO in a particular country has an issue, oftentimes they know someone at the company or are able to pick up the phone and call, a local government representative just because we have all these relationships. And they're able to work to resolve the issue rather than it simmering and growing. And this is really an intangible value of the participants having access to each other. Participants can also join together to put pressure on repressive governments and their public security forces to do better. So it's really a great collective action item. But ultimately, by working together, we can create joint approaches and partnerships to address these really challenging challenges. And then lastly, in addition to the stability and security aspects, VPIs promotes a more stable investment environment and safeguards investment. So if you're looking at inward investments, by becoming a Voluntary Principles Initiative member, the government actually demonstrates its commitment to protecting the extractive sector investments by promoting a working environment that it reduces investors' exposure to operational, legal, and reputational costs and risks that are often associated with conflicts surrounding the extractive industry projects. Governments and the voluntary principles can encourage national companies, so companies that are their domestic companies, to help improve to join the voluntary principles to help improve the reputation of those companies and make them business partners that are useful for joint ventures with the host governments. And then another benefit for prospective investors is that they have greater confidence in their ability to negotiate best practices, therefore making country more desirable for investment. Or if you're an investing company or country, official promotion of best practices can lead to lower company risks and safeguarding of the reputation of industry and demonstration that the country is a responsible destination for investment. So a positive reputation can obviously aid negotiations on mining issues or mining leases as well. So ultimately lowering the risk of violence, conflict, human rights incidents around resource projects can actually enhance commercial outcomes and therefore returns to investors and tax revenues. So lastly, I want to give a plug to some of the really great tools that come out of the voluntary principles. A lot of these have been put together by members or observers, oftentimes some of them working together. I think Maura mentioned one of them earlier. We have the model clauses for MOUs between companies and public service security contracts, and these are all available on the VPI website. But this is a really great document to include. You can include the model clauses in your contracts with public and private security. There's a general toolkit for addressing security and human rights challenges in complex environments. There's human rights due diligence guidance. There's also a publicly available training for companies to use in training their public and private security. There's an auditing tool, performance indicators. And then lastly, we are currently putting together an implementation 101 document for new and smaller companies to help make it easier to start off and get going on implementing the voluntary principles. And we're hopeful that'll be available a bit later this year. So with that, I will hand it back to Kaveh.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Leslie. That was great. So thanks again to all our panelists. We have about 5 minutes remaining, which is by no means enough time, but we've got a few questions. So the first one from Richard Graves, interested to know more about guidance and support regarding conflict-affected regions. How can I get more information? Maura, maybe that one's best directed to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, just a few points. As we mentioned earlier, the VPs requires a conflict assessment, a conflict analysis part of a risk assessment. And we know that conflict-affected areas are huge challenges for companies because they need to not only respect human rights, but also avoid exacerbating the conflict, which are very different things, as a matter of fact. And a new UN Working Group report came out in 2020, which did call upon companies to exercise enhanced due diligence. I forgot what they called it. Enhanced due diligence in conflict-affected areas. So I should say too, there's some tools already available that are really useful. Again, as Leslie noted, there's on the VP's website on the implementation page. For example, International Alert has a tool on conflict-affected areas. The IFC, DCAF, ICRC has a toolkit for complex environments. Anyway, these tools are all excellent, and there's more as well. Additionally, internally in the voluntary principles, we're actually working on this issue. You know, what does heightened due diligence mean in conflict-affected areas? Deepening our understanding of what a conflict means when we do a conflict analysis. This is led by PAC's CDA Collaborative and Jonathan Drimmer. So this is something we're hoping will come out probably in pieces. I think Brian is involved with that as well. And internally also, we do have webinars. We have thematic webinars that go into some of these issues as well for our membership. I don't know if Brian has anything to add.
No, Maura, I think you've summarized it quite well, but certainly there are a number of tools out there. There's a lot of work being done on that front, as you mentioned, and a lot of these tools are publicly accessible.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Maura. We had a raised hand from Hama Mohan. I apologize for mispronouncing that if I am. I'm going to unmute you. Can you go ahead and ask your question? Okay. Well, while we get that sorted out, there's another question in the chat about who should be involved in the Voluntary Principles risk assessment, and same person asking also about private security personnel, whether there are means and force options that can be used. I imagine that means like, how do we pressure private security personnel to comply with the voluntary principles? Maybe I'll put that question to Brian. I guess maybe you're best placed to answer those.
Yeah, thanks, Kaveh. So let me get to the second question first about means for use of force for private security personnel. I don't think it's much different. Different regulations and legislation in countries determine what private security may and may not use in terms of protection as opposed to public security. But certainly, I think it's, once again, getting back to the use of force continuum. What force would be necessary proportionate to whatever situation you are dealt with? And just on that front, it's about, as much as about protecting your security staff, whether it's private or public security, from whatever threats there might be. But certainly the big drive is looking at the use of less lethal weaponry, and I think training and skilling of people is critical. So, in short, I hope that answers the question. And the first question, Kaveh, maybe just repeat it.
Yeah, who should be involved in the Voluntary Principles risk assessment?
Okay, yeah, and I think it's very valid and very good question. And the Voluntary Principles risk assessment should not just be for security. You need a multidisciplinary approach to it, because a lot of your potential human rights impacts and potential human rights abuse that might transpire involves a lot of different disciplines. So from your community and government relations to your safety colleagues to security, and it could be more, depending on what part of the risk assessment you're looking at.
It's wonderful. Thank you so much, Brian. I think we're at time, but I will ask, if you don't mind, I will ask one last question to all our panelists. I know that there are people attending today who are probably thinking about membership in the organization and might be thinking about how to overcome maybe resistance in their own organizations about joining. So the question to all our three panelists, how do you think you should go about getting stakeholder buy-in within your company, government, or NGO in order to join the voluntary principles? What would be the best argument that you would make to overcome any potential resistance? Maybe we'll start with Leslie for the government view.
Sure. I think that the number one thing I'd say is that by joining the voluntary principles, you show commitment to upholding your obligations to respect for human rights under the UNGPs. I just want to say that in the past, I know that there's been a barrier in joining the VPs for some countries due to the dues system, but we've recently redone the dues system to help remove that barrier. And currently, if you are non-OECD country, you actually don't pay dues. So that is a new change in the voluntary principles governance rules, which I think that we need to talk more about, because definitely financial contributions have been an impediment in the past, but we're hoping to fix that.
Excellent. Thank you, Leslie. And I'll say also for the corporate pillar, we've recently adopted some changes to make it easier for companies with lower revenue to pay less. That's excellent. Doug, over to you.
Yeah, I'd say for especially smaller NGOs, it really allows them to have access to the people they are trying to influence, to basically achieve their mission. Instead of sort of being on their own, they're part of a much larger group and they're reaching out to the people that they really want to influence. It does require some commitment, that's a reality. But the return really, I think, for most NGOs has a real value to them.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, and that's in keeping with the point you were making earlier about this being an influence multiplier. So Brian, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kaveh. I think not much to add on this question. I think Leslie earlier spoke about a lot of the benefits, especially for business and companies. It's not just about the reputational benefits, the commercial benefits, the competitiveness. I think it's the right thing to do, and Leslie hit the nail on the head just now. I think as good corporate citizens, our respect for human rights is critical, and I think that is the big benefit we get out of it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I want to apologize to everybody for going over for about 3 minutes, but I want to let you know that if you've got follow-up questions, the Secretariat will be more than happy to answer them. Just look at our website, and there's a form there where you can reach out to us. I want to again thank Brian, Doug, and Leslie for their wonderful input. Thank you, Mauro, for your great presentation. And most importantly, thank you to everybody that attended the session. We hope that you found it useful. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.